This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and this is my Edge of Eternities Archetype Guide. I've already evaluated every single card in the set, and in this video, I'm going to break down the synergies for each of the two color archetypes in the format. This video focuses on what each of these color pairs wants to do in the format, and that means I'm generally not going to just mention cards that are really good in every kind of deck, like Premium Removal and Bombs, unless they have some specific synergy within a color pair. If you want to know more about my thoughts on what's good in this set more broadly, check out my set review. Alright, let's get started. So let's start with blue-black. So as usual, every color pair in this set has a signpost uncommon. In this set, there's only one signpost uncommon per color pair. Lately, we've been seeing a few more than one. And this time around, the blue-black signpost uncommon is Alfariel, Dreaming Acolyte. When he enters, you draw 2 and discard 2 unless you discard an artifact. So blue-black is an artifact deck. That's what this signpost uncommon wants to tell us. And it's sort of a grindy deck for artifacts where you want to be drawing cards and generating value a little more slowly with your artifact stuff. We'll see that there's another color pair into artifacts that is more about aggro, but this one is the slower one that can grind out value with cards like Alfariel, which gets a lot better when you have artifacts to discard. So what are the artifact payoffs at common and uncommon in blue-black? Well, there's Alfariel, of course. There's also Cerebral Download, which surveils X, where X is a number of artifacts you control, and then you draw 3 cards. So if you have a lot of artifacts, that can really go off because you get to see so many cards and maybe even load your graveyard. You're always going to draw 3, but seeing all of those cards and getting that card selection makes the card a lot stronger. There's also Cloud Sculpt Technician, which gets +1/+0 as long as you control an artifact. There's Gravblade Heavy, which gets +1/+0 and Death Touch as long as you control an artifact. There's Mechan Assembler, which has a really powerful effect. Anytime another artifact you control enters, you create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token, but it triggers only once a turn. That's the kind of card that I think will really be at home in this deck, which wants to grind out value with artifacts, because generating extra bodies is a huge deal. Mechan Shieldmate is a creature with Defender most of the time, but if an artifact enters, it loses Defender. Monoist Circuit Feeder is going to be one of the premium cards for this deck because it turns into a simultaneous removal spell and board pump effect when it enters, and also just has a 6 mana 4/4 flying body, which is a threat in its own right. It's going to be one of the most important payoffs for this deck. Scour for Scrap is a 4 mana instant that lets you search your library for an artifact card and return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. I have some concerns about this card in terms of not adding to the board and needing some setup like an artifact in your graveyard, but if there's a deck for it, obviously it's this one. It becomes a 4 mana draw 2, and the 2 cards you draw are pretty good. There is Selfcraft Mechan, which when it enters lets you sack an artifact, and when you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and draw a card. One thing you'll note is a lot of these are artifacts, and that all means they're enablers and payoffs, which is always nice. Steel Swarm Operator can tap for mana for artifacts. It can produce 1 blue to cast artifact spells, and it can produce 2 blue to spend this mana only to activate on abilities of artifacts. So let's look at the rares that work well here. Well, there's Emissary Escort, a 2 mana 0/4 that gets +X/+0, where X is the greatest mana value among other artifacts you control. There's Memenon, the right hand, which turns into a value engine when you have enough artifacts, because it lets you play artifacts from the top of your library, and it also lets your artifacts tap for mana, but only to cast cards from anywhere other than your hand. So this means the top of your library, but it also means cards with warp, which is a big deal in the format. There's Secluded Starforge, which can make artifact creature tokens, and its other activated ability lets you buff creatures by tapping artifacts. There's Synthesizer Lab Ship. Its 2+ charge counter ability makes it so at the beginning of combat you can animate artifacts into 2/2 flyers. You can use this on things that aren't already artifacts, or you can use it to upgrade an artifact creature that you might have. There's also Tezzeret Cruel Captain. He gains loyalty counters when artifacts enter. He can untap artifacts and creatures. He can tutor up artifacts with mana value 1 or less. And his ultimate puts 3 +1/+1 counters on an artifact you control, and if it's not a creature, it becomes a 0/0 robot artifact creature. So that's blue-black. It's a grindier artifact deck. There's also blue-red, which is more aggressive. Here the signpost uncommon is Memenon, Uthros Exile. And whenever an artifact you control enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. One thing to note about most of the artifact payoffs in this set is that they don't care whether things are tokens. And that's good news because this format has a bunch of artifact tokens in the form of robots and landers and stuff. So these are going to be even better than they usually are when these cards say non-token. And blue-red is mostly about using artifacts to make your creatures stronger. You know, that's sort of what an aggro deck would be doing, and that's what Memanon is doing here. So what are the payoffs at common and uncommon? Well, there's Memanon, and then there's the others that we've already seen. Things like Steel Swarm Operator, which can tap for mana. Things like Self-Craft Mechan, which can let you sack artifacts to make it bigger and draw a card. Mechan Shieldmate might be a little better in this deck because it's a 2-mana 3/2. And if you can play an artifact on turn 3 and you're like the beatdown, being able to attack with this on turn 2 is pretty strong. Same thing with the Technician. It might be a little bit better here because it becomes a better attacker when you control artifacts. And a Mechan Assembler, I think, is probably a little more well-suited to the blue-black deck, but one sweet thing about it is if Memanon's in play, anytime you play an artifact, you're going to get another token and another counter because of that ability. Then there's stuff like Oreplate Pangolin, which you can pay 1 generic anytime you have an artifact in or to put a counter on it. There is Weft Stalker Ardent, which does 1 damage to your opponent anytime a creature or artifact enters. And there's Slag Drill Scrapper, which lets you sacrifice artifacts or lands to draw cards. When it comes to rares, we've already seen most of them, but there is also Pinnacle Emissary, which is a blue-red card, which is really strong. It generates a 1/1 flyer anytime you cast an artifact spell, and it has Warp for blue-red hybrid mana, which means there might be turns where you can play this earlier and then drop an artifact and get a token worth of value out of it. Rust Harvester is also quite strong. You do have to get artifacts in your graveyard, but once they're there, it can exile them, turn them into counters, and into burn spells. So it can turn into a crazy value engine if you've got stuff in your graveyard. And Tanic Steadfast Second gives your artifact cards and red creatures warp for 2 generic and a red. Warmaker Gunship does damage equal to the number of artifacts you control when it enters, making it one of these really good spacecraft because it's a removal spell to begin with, and then it turns into a threat later. So that's blue-red. It's a more aggressive artifact deck. Let's move to black-red now, where the focus is most on the Void mechanic. It's not the only color pair with Void, but it is the color pair with the most Void, and that is the most concentrated on it. Our signpost uncommon here is Interceptor Mechan. It's a 4-mana 2/2 flyer. When it enters, you can return an artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. That's pretty good value to begin with, but it also has a Void trigger. And Void checks to see if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn or a spell was warped this turn, and if it did, something good happens. In this case, the Mechan gains a +1/+1 counter. So not only can this give you a 2-for-1 up front by bringing back an artifact or creature, it can also grow into a very real threat. Its interest trigger does work nicely with Void because in this deck, you're likely to want to give up permanents sometimes to trigger other cards with Void, and this can get them back. So in terms of payoffs and enablers, I went a little deeper here than I usually do, mostly because there are so many different ways to trigger Void, and I wanted to touch on all of them in some capacity. So one of the ways is with lander tokens. So you've got a card like Beamsaw Prospector, which makes a lander when it dies, and landers can be sacrificed for 2 generic. That counts as something that will trigger Void. You can also run things that sacrifice artifacts, like Comet Crawler, which when it attacks has you sack a creature or artifact, and if you do, it gets a buff, and it will also help trigger your things with Void. Cheap cards with Warp, like Saurian Voidborn, which has Void for only 1 black mana, are going to be really efficient ways to trigger Void sometimes. Hilderblade is a card with Void. It equips to a creature for free at the beginning of your instep if you've done the Void thing. Hymn of the Faller is a better draw spell if you've triggered Void. Voidforged Titan triggers at your instep if you did the Void thing, and you get draw a card and lose a life if you did. Caveron Skywarden gains a +1/+1 counter at the beginning of your instep. Plasma Bolt becomes an even better removal spell. Tragic Trajectory, same thing. It's already a good removal spell, but it becomes a better one. Roving Actuator, when it enters, lets you cast a spell, a cheap spell from your graveyard for free if you've triggered Void. Insatiable Skittermaw is another creature that gains a +1/+1 counter. And then there are also some ways to sacrifice them in addition to Comet Crawler that will work nicely. When you're sacrificing things for value already and you have something like Lightless Evangel in play, which will gain a counter whenever you sack a creature or artifact, and then you're also triggering Void, that's a lot of value. And Umbral Collar Zealot is probably the premier way to trigger Void just because it can do it for free and for some very real value, and it has good stats. As I said throughout the set review, I do have concerns about Void because every other time we've seen a mechanic like this, it's underwhelmed. The cards basically already had to be good without Void to be good. And that makes me worry about cards like Insatiable Skittermaw, for example. The thing is, it always looks like these are going to be easier to trigger than you think, because you say, well, this happens all the time, and there are built-in ways to trigger it. But you need the card with Void, and you need the thing to happen that will trigger Void all in the same turn, and that lines up a lot less frequently than you'd think. There's always a window where these cards can be pretty bad, like killing a Skittermaw for 1 mana, for example, is a pretty backbreaking play. I do think this might be better than other versions, and these are things like Revolt and Morbid, which checked for various things. Revolt actually checked to see if a permanent left the battlefield. Morbid specifically looked to see if a creature died. I do think the addition of Warp especially may make this better than those other incarnations, but I do think some of these cards ask way too much for you, like the Actuator demanding that you have a spell of the right mana value in your graveyard to actually do something is kind of a bummer too. So I do have some concerns about this color pair just because of how this kind of mechanic has fared in the past, but it does look like there's pretty good support for it. What are the rares here? Well, you've got Alfariel Stone Chosen, whose Void ability makes your opponent lose half their life rounded up when it attacks. Elegy Acolyte, now this is one that is just going to be good like no matter what, because it's a good card anyway. 4 mana, 4/4 lifelink, and whenever one or more of your creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card and lose a life. Great card. And then it has Void on top of that, and it interacts pretty well with how the Acolyte works, because if you triggered Void at the beginning of your instep, you make a 2/2 robot token, and that means every time you attack your opponent with something, they have to decide whether to try to block it and trade with it and let you draw a card, or block and then let you make a robot. So things can get kind of out of hand with that card. It's very strong. Corral of the Void, I have less confidence in just because it's an enchantment and there's this window where your opponent can blow you out. It's expensive, it needs some setup, but it does let you reanimate stuff from your opponent's graveyard, and if you trigger Void, it does stick around. If you don't, it gets sacrificed. I have Tanic here because he's a way to give your creatures Warp and artifacts Warp, and Warp works nicely here. Memorial Vault lets you give up artifacts to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is 1 plus the mana value of the sacrificed artifact. So it can trigger Void and potentially draw you more cards. And this is pretty much, if there is a deck in the format for weapons manufacturing, it's this one. It likes it when you have non-token artifacts enter, so you need to be doing that. But also, it makes these tokens that don't do anything unless they leave the battlefield. So if you have some sacrifice outlets, you can make it work, turn those tokens into shocks. So that's black-red. It's a Void deck. You want your stuff to be leaving the battlefield in a variety of ways. It does also count blinking and stuff, by the way. That's just not going to actually come up that much in black-red because black-red doesn't usually get that. Mostly you're going to be using effects like sacrifice, killing your opponent's creatures, trading. Things like that are going to be what triggers Void for you most of the time. All right, let's move now to red-white. It is the deck that's the most into spacecraft in the format. That's a big theme in this set in general. They happen to be artifacts, so they work with most of the decks we've talked about so far. But red-white specifically has a bunch of payoffs for having spacecraft or for having tapped things. And you have to tap creatures to station spacecraft, so it works out nicely. For example, our signpost uncommon here is Sammy Ship's Engineer, a 4-mana 2/4, and if you control 2 or more tapped creatures at your instep, you make a 2/2 robot artifact creature token. So things can kind of snowball with these because you're already stationing, and then you get another body that can help you station. It is worth noting they can be tapped in any way. It doesn't matter. Stationing is the way to do it without putting your creatures at risk, but sometimes you can just attack and trigger this too, which is going to feel just as good. So what are the other payoffs for doing spacecrafty station things? Well, in addition to Sammy, there's a card like Dawnstrike Vanguard, which if you control 2 or more tapped creatures at your instep, puts a +1/+1 counter on all your stuff except itself. There is Flight Deck Coordinator, which at the beginning of your instep, if you control 2 or more tapped creatures, you gain 2 life. There is Frontline War Rager, same kind of trigger, but in this case, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. There's Starfighter Pilot, which when it becomes tapped, surveils 1. There's Vault Guard Trooper, which at the beginning of your instep, if you have 2 of those tapped creatures, you can discard your hand and draw 2. So it's a nice way to reload your hand and keep getting gas. Drill Too Deep is an artifact removal spell that also has a mode where you can put charge counters on your spacecraft, which can potentially turn them into creatures out of nowhere. Focus Fire is a removal spell that does damage to attacking or blocking creatures, and it gets better the number of creatures and or spacecraft you control. And Invasive Maneuvers is a good removal spell that gets better if you control a spacecraft. Pulsar Squadron Ace is a 2-mana 1/2 where you reveal the top 5, and if you see a spacecraft, you put it into your hand, and if you don't, it gets a counter. Systems Override is an effect that you can use to steal your opponent's stuff, which might mean it's actually better in the black-red deck, which has ways to sacrifice things, more of them. But it's interesting here because you can actually use it on your own spacecraft, and part of the effect puts 10 charge counters on it. So this is likely to turn any one of your spacecrafts into a creature for a turn, which could have some value in this deck, in addition to a card like Systems Override just being kind of good in aggro decks in general, because you can get a blocker out of the way and attack them with it. There's Thaumaton Torpedo, an artifact that can destroy non-land permanents, but it gets cheaper if you attack with a spacecraft this turn. So, rares that work nicely with this theme. There's Sunstar Chaplain, another card that likes it if at your instep you have 2 or more tapped creatures. In this case, it puts a +1/+1 counter on something. You can actually use its ability to remove its own counters and pay 2 to tap other artifacts or creatures, which does kind of give you another way to trigger these effects. It does seem like it'll kind of be a wash most of the time because you give up a counter to do it, but if you have other triggers around, he can be used to tap your own stuff in addition to your opponent's. There is the Seriema, which is itself a spacecraft. I don't think it's super playable unless you have a couple of legendaries in your deck, but that is doable, and it's going to be extra good in this deck because you've also got spacecraft payoffs. Warmaker Gunship we already saw as an artifact payoff, but it's a spacecraft. It'll work nicely here too. Lumen Class Frigate is a spacecraft that is an anthem well before it ever becomes a creature, and then can become a pretty good creature. I also have a Stelly Reclaimer here, so its enters trigger returns a non-creature non-land with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's not going to be that easy to have non-creature non-lands in your graveyard. It just isn't usually in terms of permanence. Like, it has to be a permanent. And in Limited, you're not going to have that many of them, except all of these spacecraft work. So if your opponent killed one of your spacecraft, it does give you something to reanimate, so it works nicely here. So that's red-white. It likes going wide and stationing things and tapping your stuff down for value. Black-white is a somewhat similar deck. It is also a go-wide deck. The signpost in common here is Sir Vondam, the Lucent. He's a 5-mana 4/4 with Death Touch and Lifelink, and when he enters or attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. So yeah, he's screaming at you, go as wide as you can, attack with me, and we'll do tons of damage. So what are the payoffs and enablers for going wide in addition to Sir Vondam? Well, we already saw Dawnstrike Vanguard. It works nicely in the red-white deck because it likes it when your stuff's tapped. This deck is going to be less into spacecraft, but it's still going to have tap stuff, and it's going to be wide, so the counters are going to be good. You've got a card like Dual Sun Adepts, which is a 3-mana 2/2 double strike that can also buff your whole board. You've got Faller's Faithful, a card that I was wrong about in my set review. I overlooked the fact that you can actually target your own stuff with it, so it's another way, by the way, to enable Void, but you can also use it to get rid of a token that you've made in this deck and destroy your own thing and draw 2, in addition to having a mode where it can kill the opponent's stuff, which is nice. But here it's suitable because you're going to have tokens and stuff to kill for drawing 2 cards, which is pretty good. Focus Fire works here just like it does in the red-white deck. Honored Knight Captain makes a 1/1 token when it enters, so it gives you 2 bodies. You can also give it up to tutor up equipment. Knight Luminary can make up to 3 bodies because you can warp it to get 1/1/1. Then you can cast it, get the 3/2, and then get another 1/1. So it's going to be a key common in this deck for going wide. Lux Knight Breacher gets a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature and or artifact you control. Susurian Voidborn, which we saw earlier just because it's a really good enabler for Void in terms of warp. It works nicely here because you're going to have a bunch of bodies, you're going to be sending them at your opponent, and when those things die, they drain your opponent life. That kind of effect always makes combat kind of a nightmare for your opponent. There's also Zealous Display, which gives +2/+0 to your whole board until end of turn. And there's Vote Out, a removal spell that has Convoke, which this deck will be especially good at using. So, what are the rares here? Well, there's Adagia, Windswept Bastion. It can create copies of artifacts or enchantments you control, token copies. So, the ideal thing in this deck is to do creatures. There's also Cosmogrand Zenith, which has 2 triggers that are very attractive for this deck. If you cast your second spell in a turn, you can either make 2 1/1 human soldier creature tokens, so it can help you go wide, or if you're already wide, put a +1/+1 counter on everything. Exalted Sunborn makes all your token-making effects better in addition to just being a good creature. Halia, Guided by Light, likes it when you have creatures or artifacts enter because she gains you life. If enough of them enter, she can actually draw you a card. Lumen class frigate, probably best in this deck because of that Anthem effect, which is going to be better in a deck that's this good at going wide. There's also another Servandem Sunstar Exemplar. He's a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance and Menace, and if you have creatures die, he gets counters and gains life, and so in a deck where you're going really wide, that's going to happen more. Thrumming Hivepool is the Sliver card in the set, and it makes 2 Sliver creature tokens every turn. They also have haste and double strike, so it's a good way to go wide too. So that's black-white. It's about going wide. You can also mix in a bit of the sacrifice stuff from black-red because you're going to have extra bodies to sacrifice and things like that. Let's move now to blue-white, which is another aggressive deck, but this one's specifically interested in double spelling. So this color pair has a bunch of cheap cards that make it easy for you to double spell. And then it has payoffs for doing it, like Station Monitor, a 2-mana 2/2 that spits out a 1/1 drone artifact creature token with flying that can only block other flyers. That's a strong payoff. Adding a real body to the board, a flyer, is just really good, and there's lots of value to be had with artifacts in general. So what are the other payoffs we have here? Well, there's Ilvoy Operative, who puts a +1/+1 counter on itself when you cast your second spell. There's Sunstar Lightsmith, which puts a counter on itself and draws you a card when you cast your second spell. There's Uthros Psionicist, which makes your second spell cast each turn cost 2 generic less to cast, so it makes it easier to trigger all of these things. Bright Spear Zealot gets +2/+0 as long as you've cast 2 or more spells in a turn. Ilvoy Infiltrator becomes unblockable if you cast 2 or more spells in a turn. And I have Starfield Shepherd here as a stand-in for like all the cheap cards with Warp. So not only is it good to be playing like 1 and 2 mana cards because it'll let you trigger these things more, you can actually probably trigger it more than you'd think based on what your curve looks like, because you have Warp cards like the Shepherd, which has a 2-mana Warp mode, which means on turn 4, you can cast a 2-drop and then do this with Warp and trigger your Station Monitor if it's in play. So there are a lot of ways to trigger it that are plentiful because the Warp mechanic is pretty pronounced in blue-white. So it looks to me like there's like just enough support and enough payoffs for this color pair to generate some serious value with those double spells. There is really only one rare that really fits in great here. I mean, anything with Warp can, like I said, but there's only one card that does a double spell thing at higher rarities, and we already saw it. And in this deck, it's going to be easier for you to trigger it than in red-white. And again, it makes 2/1/1 Human Soldiers, Cosmic Grand Zenith, or puts a counter on all your stuff. So let's move now to another fairly aggressive color pair, green-white, which is all about +1/+1 counters. Here our signpost uncommon is Halia Ascendant Cadet, which is a 5-mana 3/3 that when it enters or attacks, puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And whenever 1 or more creatures you control with counters on them deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So she is one of these cards that's an enabler and a payoff because she puts counters on things both when she enters and attacks, and can then draw you cards when your creatures with counters on them hit your opponent. So what other payoffs do we have? Well, there's Dockworker Drone, which comes with a counter, and when it dies, lets you put its counters on something else. There's Drix Fatemaker, which gives all your creatures with counters on them trample, and it can put a counter on something when it enters, and it has Warp, so it can potentially do it twice. Melt Strider Eulogist likes it when your creatures with counters on them die because it draws you a card. Rayblade Trooper is another card that puts a counter on a creature you control when it enters that comes with Warp. And whenever you have a non-token creature with a counter on it die, you create a 1/1 white Human Soldier creature token. Starport Security has a tap-activated ability that gets cheaper if you control a creature with a counter on it. So what rares fit well here? Well, the most notable one might be Diadrine Synthesis Amalgam, because it enters with +1/+1 counters, and when you attack, you can remove a counter from each of 2 creatures you control, and if you do, you draw a card and make a robot creature token. There are also cards that are like all in on counters, like Loading Zone, which makes it so that if you would put counters on a creature, spacecraft, or planet you control, you get twice that many of those kinds of counters. So it works well with stationing too. But these kinds of cards always worry me when they're all in on it, because they, all these other cards we've looked at are creatures who do things with counters, right? But a card that needs you to also have counters, in addition to being a card that doesn't add to the board on its own, those are often liabilities and limited. But if there is a deck for Loading Zone, this is it. We've also got Cosmic Grand Zenith again because of the counter ability. There's also Ouroboros, which puts a bunch of counters on your stuff every turn. There's Sunstar Chaplain again. This deck can more effectively put counters on him. There's also Terra Symbiosis, which, like Loading Zone, doesn't do anything on its own, but it is a big payoff for putting counters on things because you get to draw cards once a turn when you do. All right, let's move to black-green now. It's a graveyard deck, and interestingly, it's the only, like, pure graveyard deck in this format. Usually there's a little bit of graveyard stuff going on in both black-white and black-red, but this is the only one that's, like, all in on it, as Seed Ship Broodtender can show you. It's a 2-mana 2/3. When it enters, mills 3, and then it can reanimate creatures or spacecraft from your graveyard by paying 5 and sacking itself. So it's another one of these signpost uncommons that's an enabler and a payoff. What are the other payoffs? Well, they're unfortunately kind of sparse. You've got the Broodtender. There's also Fell Graveship, which mills 3 when it enters, and then you can return a creature or spacecraft from your graveyard to your hand. Pull Through Weft lets you return 2 non-land permanents from your graveyard and get 2 lands out of your graveyard, so it's a potential 4-for-1 in this deck. Scrounge for Eternity is a cheaper than usual reanimation spell with a mana value 5 or less restriction. Also gives you a lander token. Timeline Color is pretty sweet because it's a creature who can be warped out of your graveyard and just basically keep coming back as long as you have mana and life. But that's pretty much it, and they're all uncommon, so it sort of looks to me like black-green is more of a good stuff deck with a little bit of graveyard value stuff going on. There are some rares that support this strategy. Icetill Explorer has Landfall Mill a card and lets you play lands from the graveyard, in addition to letting you play lands every turn. And Zoo Ifrit lets you reanimate creatures from your graveyard for no mana at all, but they do come back with no abilities. Alright, let's move now to the last 2 color pairs, which both are very into lands. There's red-green, which is into landers and landfall. The signpost uncommon here is Tannic Memorial Ensign, and when a land enters in this case, you do 1 to your opponent, and if it's a second time this ability is resolved this turn, you draw a card. So just playing 1 land a turn allows him to pressure your opponent a little bit, but you really want to be playing more than 1 to get a ton of value out of him, and the best way to do that pretty much is with lander tokens. That's the easy way to enable it in this format. So you've got cards like Tannic Memorial Ensign as payoffs. There's also Glacier Godmaw, a big 7-mana 6/6 trampler, makes a lander when it enters, and it has a landfall ability that gives +1/+1 vigilance and haste to your whole board. There's Harmonious Grove Strider, which doesn't have landfall, but it likes lands because its power and toughness are each equal to it. Ice Cave Crasher gets +1/+0 when a land enters. Remnant Elemental gets +2/+0 when a land enters. Seed Ship Agrarian is a 4-mana 3/3 that makes a lander when it gets tapped, and it has landfall, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Territorial Bruntar is a super powerful landfall trigger that lets you reveal cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card, and then you can cast that card this turn, so it basically draws you a card with landfall. Social Engineering spits out a 2/2 robot artifact creature token with landfall. It also has warp, so you can play it earlier in the game and then maybe play a land and crack a lander and get a couple 2/2s out of it even before you get to 5 mana. Eumidian Terrabotanist gains you a life when a land enters. So the rares that work well here, there is Biotech Specialist, which makes a lander when it enters and likes it when you sack artifacts because it does 2 to the opponent. There's Famished World Sire, which is not a card I love. It doesn't just automatically win you the game the way an 8-mana card that devours all your lands should, but it does work nicely in this deck if it's going to work anywhere, because it will trigger all of your landfall stuff a ton, because it gobbles up all your lands and then basically rips all your rest of your lands out of your deck and puts them on the battlefield all at once. So it can be a powerful effect. Might Form Harmonizer has a landfall trigger that doubles the power of target creature you control until end of turn. Also has warp, so you can set it up earlier. We already saw Icetill Explorer. In this deck, it's less about like helping you do a bunch of graveyard stuff and really just about those lands that can help you play from the graveyard. There's Bioengineered Future, which gives you a lander and can help your creatures enter with more counters for each land you had enter the battlefield this turn. So the other color pair, and the last one, is also into landers, but instead of using them to trigger landfall and make your creatures stronger and do damage to your opponent, it's more of a ramp deck. So here, the signpost uncommon is Biomechan Engineer, a 2-mana 2/2 that makes a lander when it enters. It's already a great rate. And you can pay 8 generic to draw 2 and make a 2/2 robot artifact creature token. So again, this is one that's an enabler, gives you a lander, helps you ramp your mana, and then it's a great place to sink that mana because its activated ability is a really strong one, especially when you're in like top deck mode and all you really need to do is find some action. It gives you action and even adds to the board once you get there. Payoffs. This might actually be the better home for Glacier Godmaw because it's so expensive. I also think this deck is the most suited to the few cards in this format that say something about the number of differently named lands you control. You know, the red-green deck can also splash because it has a lot of landers, but it seems like it's going to be more streamlined into being aggressive and winning with landfall triggers as opposed to grinding out value with landfall triggers and ramping your mana so you can do big, powerful things. So this deck is more likely to have access to a third and fourth color and thus be able to decrease the cost of cards that say draw X, for example, like this one, where X is a number of differently named lands you control. Most of the time in most limited decks, you're going to have 2 differently named lands, but this deck might have an easier time running more basics to set cards like this up because it's so into slowly grinding out value with those lander tokens. It also doesn't hurt that the bonus sheet has a bunch of lands on it, so you can also make these cards better with that sort of thing. I have Pinnacle Killship here just because it's an expensive card that I think will be the most viable in this deck. Not every deck wants a 7-mana spacecraft, but it does kill something, and then you can station it into a 7/7 flyer. Fungal Colossus is another card that's very into differently named lands you control. It makes itself cheaper. Harmonious Grove Strider, we already saw power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. Larval Scoutlander helps you ramp and fix your mana. It can single-handedly get you 2 lands with different names because you sack 1 land and then grab 2 from your deck. There's also Survey Mechan, which has a strong activated ability that normally costs 10 mana, but it costs X less to activate, where X is the number of lands you control. Does 3 to any target. Target player draws 3 and gains 3. So that's some serious business that I think will be best suited to this deck, as will a big 7-drop like Mouth of the Storm, which also kind of buys you a turn beyond when it comes down because it gives all of your opponent's stuff -3, -0. Rares that work well here, well, obviously there's Genemorph Imago, which is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer with a landfall trigger, and it gets stronger the more lands you have. Normally it changes a creature's base power and toughness to 3, but if you have 6 or more lands, which this deck's going to be into, it gives that creature base power and toughness 6/6 until end of turn instead. There's also Consult the Star Charts, another card that gets better the more lands you have because it looks at the top X of your library, where X is a number of lands. Extinguisher Battleship is a super expensive spacecraft with a powerful effect that not all decks are going to have access to, but I think this one will be able to cast it. We've already seen Ice-Till Explorer and Bioengineered Future, as well as Famished World Sire and Mightform Harmonizer. So those are the 10 color pairs in Edge of Eternities. Some of these are archetypes we've seen before, green-white +1/+1 counters. Others are new and interesting, like the Spacecraft deck, which has interesting payouts for tapping things. I think landers look really strong in general, so I'm excited about those 2 color pairs. And I'm really excited to play this new format, which I'll be doing very soon, because the early access event is on Wednesday, and I'll be streaming my drafts and posting them here on the channel. If you want to make sure you catch those videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of my videos about this format, including an entire set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.